My dad kept a coffee can on the top shelf of the garage, behind a box of Christmas ornaments and a bag of rock salt he'd been meaning to use since 2019. I only knew about it because he showed me when I was 17, the summer after my mom left. He pulled it down, pried off the lid, and showed me what was inside: a folded piece of paper, a key on a plain steel ring, and about $400 in small bills. He said, "This is for the kind of emergency that doesn't announce itself." I didn't fully understand what he meant then. I do now. My dad's name was Roy. He was 61 years old when he died, which felt impossibly young to me and still does. He had a stroke in the middle of October, on a Tuesday, which I know because I'd called him that Monday evening to ask if he wanted me to bring anything for Thanksgiving planning. We always started early, and he'd said, "Just yourself and maybe some of that cranberry bread you made last year." He died 31 hours after that conversation. He never regained consciousness. I'm 32. I work in accounting. I've been in this field long enough to know how money moves, where it hides, and what it looks like when someone is trying to move it before anyone else notices. My brother's name is Kevin. He's 36 and he lives about 40 minutes from where our dad lived, which is a 40-minute drive he made maybe a dozen times in the last 2 years. I know this not because I was keeping score, but because my dad mentioned it, quietly, in the way he mentioned things he didn't want to make a big deal out of. "Kevin's been busy." That was the phrase. "Kevin's been busy." My dad said it the way you say the weather's been rough, not complaining, just acknowledging. I was the one who drove up on weekends when the gutters needed cleaning. I was the one who took my dad to his cardiology follow-up in March and sat in the waiting room for 2 hours reading a 4-month-old copy of Sports Illustrated. I was the one who learned which pharmacy filled his prescriptions fastest and which urgent care had the shortest wait time on Saturdays. None of that is me patting myself on the back. I'm saying it because it matters to the story. When my dad had the stroke, I was the first call. His neighbor, a retired woman named Sandy who had his spare key and checked on him every few days, found him and called 911 and then called me because my number was on the little laminated card he kept on the refrigerator. I drove to the hospital in a kind of suspended state that I can only describe as functional shock. I remember every traffic light. I remember the smell of the parking garage. I remember that the waiting room had a television playing a home renovation show with the sound off, and that I watched people demo a kitchen wall without hearing any of it for about 2 hours. Kevin arrived about 3 hours after I did. His wife, I'll call her Shay, was with him. They came in together, and Kevin hugged me, and Shay touched my arm, and we all stood in that small waiting room and waited. The first sign was subtle enough that I almost missed it. We were sitting with the attending physician, getting an explanation of what had happened and what would happen next. And Kevin asked, in the middle of it, not after, in the middle of the doctor's explanation, whether our dad had updated his living will recently. The doctor paused. I looked at Kevin. Kevin looked at the doctor. The doctor, to her credit, redirected smoothly and kept going. But I noticed. I filed it away. My dad had a house. It wasn't a grand house. 3 bedrooms, a detached garage, about a quarter-acre in a town outside Columbus that had been growing steadily for the last decade. He paid it off 6 years ago and was proud of that in a quiet way. He also had a savings account and a small brokerage account that had grown over 30 years of careful, boring investing. He talked to me about all of it, not in a morbid way, but in the practical way of the man who had watched his own parents scramble after a death because no one had written anything down. He had a will. He had a trust. He had a binder. The binder was in the top drawer of his filing cabinet, labeled in his handwriting, black marker on a strip of masking tape. It contained the will, the trust documents, the deed to the house, insurance policies, account information, and a letter he'd written to me and Kevin separately. I knew about the binder. I don't know if Kevin did. My dad did not regain consciousness. He died on the Thursday afternoon, with me on one side of the bed and Kevin on the other, and Shay standing near the window. I held his hand. I don't know how long I sat there afterward. Long enough that a nurse came in and touched my shoulder gently, and I understood that meant it was time to go. The next morning, Kevin called me before 8. He said he'd been thinking about logistics. He used the word logistics. He asked if I'd found any paperwork at the house, whether I knew which bank held the primary checking account, and whether I had a sense of the timeline for the estate process. I told him I had the binder and I'd been in contact with the attorney who'd drawn up the trust. I told him the attorney would be reaching out to both of us. Kevin said that was good, and then he asked carefully, like he'd rehearsed it, whether there was any flexibility in how the liquid assets were distributed, given that he had some pressing financial obligations. I said I didn't know, which was not entirely true. I knew because my dad had told me that Kevin had been in financial trouble for a while, not dramatic trouble, not bankruptcy or anything filed, but the slow, grinding kind of trouble that comes from spending a little more than you make for a few years in a row, from a car payment that stretched too long, from a basement renovation that went over budget. My dad had helped him twice that I knew of, possibly more. The trust was clear. The house was to be sold and the proceeds split equally. The financial accounts, the savings and the brokerage, were structured differently. My dad had named me as the sole beneficiary on both, something he'd decided, he told me, because he trusted me to handle the estate costs and because he'd already helped Kevin more than Kevin knew. He said he wasn't punishing Kevin. He said he was being practical. Kevin didn't know this yet. I'm going to tell you something that sounds cold, and I need you to understand the context before you judge it. The night before my dad's funeral, I logged into the account portal and moved the primary savings balance into a separate account that Kevin had no access to and no knowledge of. The balance was $194,000. I did this because 3 days earlier I'd found something. Going through my dad's files, which I was doing because someone had to, because there was an estate to manage, I found a printout. It was a loan application. It had my dad's name on it, his social security number, his date of birth. It also had Kevin's email address in the correspondence field and a phone number I didn't recognize. The loan was for $40,000, applied for 6 weeks before my dad's stroke. My dad, as far as I could determine, had not known about it. I called the attorney. She listened to me read the whole thing out loud and then said, quietly, "You understand what this is?" It wasn't a question. I said yes. She told me to document everything, to make no accusations yet, and to be very careful about what I moved and when and how I documented the movement. She told me to call her before I did anything. I called her before I moved the money. She told me it was within my rights as the named beneficiary. She told me to keep records. I kept records. The funeral was on a Saturday. It was a gray October morning and the leaves had mostly fallen, and the church my dad had attended since I was in elementary school was full in a way that surprised me, because I sometimes forgot how many people my dad knew quietly and well over the course of his life. Kevin gave a reading. He did it well. I will give him that. Shay found me in the church fellowship hall afterward, during the reception. She came up while I was standing near the coffee table, holding a cup I wasn't drinking from, talking to one of my dad's former colleagues. She waited until the colleague moved away, and then she touched my elbow. She said, "Kevin really needs this to go smoothly. I just want you to know that going in." I looked at her for a moment. I said, "I understand." She said, "He's been under a lot of pressure. We both have. I think once the estate is settled, things will stabilize." I said, "I'm sure they will." She held my gaze a second longer than was comfortable, and then she smiled and moved away. I turned back to the coffee table and poured out the cup I was holding and got a fresh one. My hands were steady. I was surprised by that. The Sunday after the funeral, Kevin texted me. He said he'd been looking into the accounts and wanted to make sure we were aligned on next steps. I texted back that I was working with the attorney and would be in touch. He responded with a thumbs up emoji. I stared at it for a moment, and then put my phone face down on the kitchen counter. My husband, his name is Will, came in from the other room and looked at me. Will is not an excitable person. He is the kind of person who, when I told him about the loan application, sat very still for about 30 seconds and then said, "Okay, what do you need me to do?" That was it. No outrage performance, just what do you need? I have thought about that a lot since then. I told Will what Kevin had texted. He asked if I'd heard from the attorney. I said not yet today. He said, then wait. I waited. On Tuesday, 4 days after the funeral, I got a notification from the bank. Someone had attempted to initiate a transfer from my father's primary checking account. The attempt had failed because the account had already been flagged by the estate process and required co-authorization. I called the attorney. She said, "Well, that tells us something, doesn't it?" It did. Here's what I want to be precise about because I think precision matters. I did not know for certain that Kevin would try something. I suspected. I had evidence that suggested intent. I had the loan application, the questions at the hospital, Shay's conversation at the reception. I had 4 years of watching a pattern. But I didn't know. What I did was protect what I could legally protect, document what I found, and work with a professional. I did not confront Kevin. I did not accuse him. I waited. Kevin called me the following Thursday. The conversation was short. He said he'd run into some confusion with the bank and wanted to clarify the account situation. I told him, calmly, that the savings and brokerage accounts had been transferred to me as named beneficiary and were no longer part of the estate to be divided. I told him the house sale was proceeding as outlined in the trust, and his share of those proceeds would come to him through the attorney's office. There was a pause. He said, "What do you mean named beneficiary?" I said, "Dad updated the beneficiary designations 3 years ago. The attorney has the documentation." Another pause, longer. He said, "I didn't know that." I said, "I know." He said, That's not fair." His voice had changed. The careful, measured tone he'd been using was gone. What was underneath it was something I recognized from childhood. Not anger exactly, but the sound he made when something hadn't gone the way he'd planned for it to go. I said, "Dad made his decisions. I'm going to honor them." He said some other things after that. I let him say them. I didn't argue. When he was done, I told him the attorney would be reaching out with next steps, and that I hoped we could get through the rest of this without making it harder than it already was. Then I said goodbye, and I ended the call. Will was in the kitchen when I came back in. He looked at me. I sat down at the table. I sat there for probably 2 minutes without saying anything. Then I said, "I think I need to eat something." He made eggs. We sat and ate and didn't talk about Kevin and didn't talk about the money and didn't talk about any of it. There was a cardinal on the fence outside the kitchen window. I watched it for a while. The loan application was turned over to the attorney to handle in coordination with the bank. I was told it would be investigated. I don't have a verdict to give you on that because the process is ongoing and my attorney told me to be measured about what I say publicly. What I can tell you is that the bank is aware, the paperwork is documented, and it is no longer my problem to solve. It is someone else's problem now. The house sold in February. It went quickly, which surprised me, though probably shouldn't have. The market in that area had been steady. Kevin's share came to him through the attorney's office, as I'd said it would. I don't know what he did with it. I don't know if it helped. I stopped keeping track. What I kept was the coffee can. I found it when I was cleaning out the garage in January, behind the Christmas ornaments, behind the rock salt. I pried off the lid the way I'd watched my dad do it 15 years ago. The $400 was still there, a little more rumpled. The key was there, though I've never figured out what it opens. The folded paper was there, and when I unfolded it, it was a note in my dad's handwriting. It said, "For whoever finds this. The key is for the lockbox in the closet, top shelf, behind the winter coats. Don't let anyone rush you. You'll know when you're ready." I stood in that garage for a long time. It was cold. The fluorescent light hummed above me the way it always had, slightly uneven, the kind of thing you stop noticing when it's been there your whole life. I found the lockbox. Inside was another copy of the will, a letter addressed to me by name, and a photograph of my dad and me at my college graduation. I look genuinely happy in it. He does too. I keep the photograph on my desk now. Not the version of my dad I've been thinking about these last months. The pragmatic one, the careful one, the one who saw things coming and tried to prepare for them. Just the one standing next to me in the sun on a May afternoon, squinting a little because the light was in his eyes, grinning like he had somewhere to be and couldn't wait to get there. That's the one I want to remember. And I think if he'd had a choice, that's the one he'd have wanted me to keep. I keep thinking about the coffee can. Not about the money inside it, not the key, not even the note. Just the fact that my dad put it there at all. He knew, on some level, that life would eventually hand someone in this family a moment they weren't prepared for. And instead of hoping it would work out, he did something quiet and practical and completely like him. He prepared. He left a roadmap for whoever was paying enough attention to find it. I think about that a lot when I think about Kevin, not with anger. That part has mostly faded, but with something closer to sadness. Because Kevin isn't stupid. He's not even, I don't think, a bad person at his core. But somewhere along the way, he stopped doing the hard thing and started looking for the easier one. A shortcut here, a borrowed dollar there, a plan that depended on someone else not noticing. And the thing about building your life on shortcuts is that eventually the shortcuts run out, and you're left standing in an empty space where solid ground should have been. What happened with the estate wasn't karma in some cosmic mystical sense. It was just cause and effect. Kevin made choices over years, financial choices, relational choices, choices about who to be when no one was watching, and those choices narrowed what was available to him. My dad made choices too, careful ones, honest ones, choices that meant the people he trusted most were in a position to protect what he built. The outcome wasn't random. It was the sum of a long series of decisions made by people who had very different ideas about what integrity looked like in practice. I didn't move that money because I was clever. I moved it because I'd spent years paying attention. I'd gone to the appointments, read the documents, had the uncomfortable conversations about what would happen when my dad was gone. That's not intelligence in the abstract. It's the specific, unglamorous kind of knowing that comes from showing up over and over when it would have been easier not to. My dad used to say that the most important financial skill wasn't math, it was attention. He was right. He was right about a lot of things. And then there's the part I don't talk about as much, which is how hard the quiet was. Not confronting Kevin at the hospital. Not asking Shay what she meant in the fellowship hall. Not calling him out when he texted about aligning on next steps, like we were colleagues on a project. That restraint didn't come naturally. I wanted to say something every single time. What I've come to understand is that holding your ground without making noise is its own kind of strength, maybe the hardest kind. It doesn't feel powerful in the moment. It just feels like waiting. But waiting with a clear head and clean hands turned out to be exactly what the situation required. My dad left me a photograph. He left me a note. He left me a coffee can with $400 in small bills and a key that took me 45 minutes to match to a lockbox. He left me, I think, a model for how to move through something hard without losing yourself in it. Roy spent his whole life doing things the right way, even when no one was watching. Especially then. I try to do the same. I don't always succeed, but I try.